So why do I think this is important? One is I think we're starting to learn, as we've been talking about, the importance of embodied rhythms of community. That community is certainly important, and it's experienced when we are emotionally vulnerable with one another and I'm transparent and things like that. However, there are certain things that might not be expressible at the time, but we nevertheless need to reflect on how do we embody community? How are we present in our bodies together in a room and doing something that expresses our oneness in the Lord, or our relatedness in the Lord. One of my former professors, Dr. Tim Patitsis, he's a professor of ethics at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary, wrote a wonderful article called "The Opposite of War is Not Peace," because he has looked at post-war trauma, veterans trauma, and so on, and as Connie mentioned yesterday, sometimes just rehearsing that is not helpful. What is helpful is liturgy. Liturgy in the sense of a lived, embodied expression of community that people can participate in. And he goes to great lengths to show how that happens. But that's just a touchstone, a small reference point just to keep in mind. I think there are also precedents both in Scripture and in church history that are important to consider. So in Leviticus 23, God says to Israel, here's your annual calendar. These are the holy days. Why don't you retell your story through these holidays? And in church history, that these kinds of what some would call rituals, but what I would prefer to call rhythms of life become really important. How do we do life together, especially in ways that grow our faith, deepen our understanding, and deepen my involvement and presence in your life and yours in mine? What can we do together to honor our individuality, certainly, but also express the call of God, the call of Christ on our lives together? So monasticism, tends to have a negative spin, but I'm looking at it with a few other people as a response to the trauma of the violence of the Greco-Roman city. There were violent places. We know of 3 references in the early Christian literature where Christians are struggling with homoerotic pedophilia temptation. And these letters are written advising people about that. Why do people typically start struggling with that? Usually it's because they were traumatized as children or raped as children. So when Christians leave the places that they were traumatized and start to form communities, they have to ask, how do we do this in ways that we don't re-traumatize one another, because that would be awful, but also where we're growing together and we're having an appropriate level of prayer, transparency, reflection, worship together. Of course, they were tending their gardens, and so they were doing repetitive things with their hands, caring for life, which is really good for the brain, and what we call early monasticism started. I think partly, at least partly, as a response to trauma and the need to develop ways of living together in a way that is constructive and supportive. The civil rights movement had spiritual practices that they developed. Martin Luther King Jr. would invite people to join the civil rights movement, but you would have to take a pledge. Do you pledge to reflect daily on the life and teachings of Jesus? Because if you are going to go up against fire hoses and all sorts of opposition, how are you going to deal with your own resentments, anger, and sense of purpose? And why are you doing this?